Yo, what's good YouTube? It's your host Sage DSM right here, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to bring y'all a new What If, this being the What If movie, to What If Luffy had Ultra Ego. Thank y'all so much for tuning into this What If, and thank you to the person who commented on this video idea. I saw your comment, so here's the What If. Hopefully you do enjoy. And now with that being said, y'all, I don't really got much else to really announce, so I'm just going to jump right into this What If. So with that being said, let's get started.
You're never gonna make it, you're not good enough. There's a million other people with the same stuff. You really think you're different, man, you must be kidding. Think you're gonna hit it, but you just don't get it. It's impossible, it's not probable, you're irresponsible. Too many obstacles, you gotta stop it, yo. You gotta take it slow, you can't be a pro. Don't waste your time no more. Who the fuck are you to tell me what to do?
So to begin this What If, we're now going to start out with Luffy's origins. Now, dating went back all the way to the point where Luffy would still be in the East Blue, and by this point, he had just recently met up with Red Hair Shanks. We see things play out pretty similar to the main timeline, all the way to the point where Shanks' arm ends up getting bitten after trying to protect Luffy. But you see, this is where events will then change, as this event will end up triggering something in Luffy's personality, and that is the overwhelming desire to win. As after getting kidnapped by the bandits, Luffy was not able to do anything. After they were forced to literally use Luffy as a hostage, he wasn't able to do anything. And when Shanks got his arm bitten off by the Sea King after trying to protect Luffy once again, Luffy was helpless and couldn't do anything. And these thoughts will be playing in Luffy's mind constantly, as for a brief moment while being held by Shanks, we the viewers will end up seeing Luffy's eye color change from being the normal black color to being an eerie purple, as he will stay like that for a couple of moments before sinking back into Ace's chest and continue crying. As this is where we now do a time skip. Moving on, after the departure of Shanks and his crew, and after Shanks gave Luffy the straw hat, you will see Garp end up going to Luffy and being very upset about what Shanks had done, as he tries to put Luffy through the same training that he put him through in the main timeline, trying to toughen up Luffy to become a better marine, even though Luffy wants to become the king of the pirates. As during the time of training Luffy and trying to help him to get strong, we see Garp toss Luffy in the jungle just like he does in the main timeline. But you see, this will end up resulting in something drastic happening, as Garp would leave Luffy there for an entire month, as Luffy would just be there in the jungle constantly fighting for his life and toughening up, just like Garp wanted. But you see, this ends up causing something to awaken once again in Luffy, as that desire to never lose or never feel helpless like that ever again, after what happened with Shanks and everything, that desire only grew stronger the longer that Luffy was in the jungle, as Luffy was still a child, and not only that, but he had eaten a devil fruit that basically just hindered him, especially since Luffy did not have the muscle at this point yet to make full utilization of it. So due to this, Luffy was in an even worse situation, but yet somehow, someway, he still managed to come out on top, and Luffy was willing to go as far as he needed to in order to do so. As by the time the month was over, Garp ended up returning back, and he would see just how far his grandson was willing to go for victory. As soon as Garp ends up arriving at the jungle in order to pick up Luffy, he ends up seeing quite a horrific sight, as he will see Luffy currently right now in a crater, and surrounding him around this crater will be a bunch of different dead bodies of the different beasts that he slayed throughout the entire time he's been in this forest. As he mostly slayed them for survival, but also just for a fight. And not only that, but Luffy's appearance had changed. Although he was still looking like the same little boy, there was also some eerie energy that just flowed throughout him. Now, although Garp couldn't see it, we the viewer could, as we end up seeing Luffy being swirled by the power of Ultra Ego, the purplish aura that was just emanating from him, as well as we see Luffy's appearance have changed, as his eyes were no longer black and instead were a dark purple, and his hair was also dark purple as well, as Luffy will be there just tweaking out, just twitching and muttering about never losing. Now, Garp would approach this with caution, but when he does, he accidentally ends up stepping on a twig, and this ends up catching the attention of Luffy, who attacks Garp like a wild animal, as this will cause a fight between Garp and Luffy to then ensue, as it will take up the rest of that day, as Garp would be forced into a very tough situation here, mostly because of the fact that every single time he landed a blow on Luffy that wasn't meant to knock him out, Luffy would grow stronger, as that's how Ultra Ego worked. But luckily, eventually Garp is able to knock him out, landing a very powerful blow on his forehead, which caused Luffy to literally be so rattled by it that he fell unconscious. But even Garp had to admit that he did take some heavy damage from that fight, which ends up causing Garp to realize that he needs to stay way more focused on Luffy's training, in order to make sure that Luffy doesn't hurt himself, that or hurt others. As after all, if Garp hadn't been here, and let's just say it was some random person from the village, then Garp knew for sure they definitely would not have walked out of here alive. So with those thoughts in mind, we will then see Garp train Luffy much more than he actually did in the main timeline, as this will cause Luffy to build up some actual muscle, more muscle than he did at this point of the story, and causing him to actually be able to use some of his most basic moves as he did in the earlier seasons, like Gum Gum Pistol and a bunch of other basic ones. And that was not the only thing that was caused by Garp's teachings, as he also taught Luffy about self-control, whenever he's not in battle and also when he's in battle. And the main reason for this was because of the fact that Luffy currently right now, he does not have any mastery over Ultra Ego, but he's still able to snap back into that state. But you see, the thing is, after training with Luffy for the many years that went by, Garp has noticed that Luffy, if he were to go into a fight without any control at all, he would most definitely end up losing almost immediately if he was facing off against anyone that was at seas. As Ultra Ego currently right now for Luffy, if he ends up fighting without holding back at all, he immediately just simply ends up snapping into Ultra Ego, and while yes, he gets a power boost for a couple of seconds, if he's not able to one-shot his opponent immediately, Luffy's body just simply is not going to be able to handle the amount of power that he's getting. As his body is, because he's draining through his stamina immediately, and not only that, but he's straining his body the more times he's in this transformation. And add on to that, if he gets more and more damage to his body, then Luffy is eventually going to collapse, causing him to be a sitting goose literally right there in the smack middle of the fight, causing him to be at the mercy of his enemies. So Garp made sure to teach Luffy about self-control, with these teachings actually causing some changes to happen within Luffy. Now he's still going to be the same old Luffy, it's just that there are going to be certain moments where Luffy shows way more restraint when he does certain things. And not only that, but his actions are going to be way more controlled and way more thought about before he does them. So basically, all in all, we're getting a Luffy with a little bit more control over himself, and not only that, but a Luffy that thinks things through a little bit more than he usually does. As with that being said, we can now continue on with the rest of Luffy's backstory, as things play out almost the exact same way, with some slight differences here and there. As Luffy still ends up being raised by the Mountain Bandits along with Ace, he soon was able to become friends as well as brothers with Ace and Sabo, after they ended up seeing how far Luffy was willing to go to not rat on them even when he was confronted by dangerous pirates, which means Luffy ended up gaining their respect as well as their friendship, and later on they all became brothers as well. As we also end up seeing the same thing play out with Luffy, Ace and Sabo all going on various different adventures as they're collecting more and more money for their dreams, until eventually they're confronted by the Blue Jam Pirates and Sabo's his father. As thanks to the help of Luffy, Sabo, Ace, and even Dan as she pulls through as well, they're actually able to prevent Sabo from leaving, with the only difference here being the fact that, well, Luffy actually puts up much more of a fight, and this is mostly due to the fact of Garp's training. As we see this event end up playing out pretty similar to the main timeline. As unfortunately, the only few events that actually end up playing out the exact same way is the way that Sabo supposedly ends up dying. As unfortunately, he ends up setting sail the exact same day the Celestial Dragon ends up arriving, and the Celestial Dragon sees him and shoots him, causing Sabo to supposedly die, while also giving a large amount of trauma to both Luffy and Ace, even though they both have their own fair share of that. As this will cause the entire group to fall through a generous phase of depression until eventually they're able to snap right back out of it, as Luffy and Ace end up making a vow to continue on living for Sabo as they continue chasing after their dreams and continue on with training, making sure to grow strong enough to where something like that can never happen to themselves and also to the people that they care about. As after that, Ace will soon end up head off to his adventures, Luffy will continue training, and I do have to admit, by this point now, Luffy is stronger than he was canonly by this point. As after that one last year of training, we will then see Luffy say goodbye to everyone at Fuchsia Village and also say goodbye to the Mountain Bandits, as he will then set off on his own adventures, as he still ends up defeating the Sea King and soon ends up getting caught up in a generous sea tornado, causing him to be stranded in a barrel and just being sent out to seas, as we're now entering the East Blue Saga. As we end up seeing Luffy's adventures throughout this entire saga play out pretty similarly as to how it does in the main timeline. As turning to the start of Luffy's adventures throughout this saga, we see things play out almost the exact same way, as we see Luffy encountering Kobe, a cabin boy aspiring to be a marine officer, and soon after getting to know him and basically just befriending him, Luffy then decides to defeat Alvida, a pirate captain that was terrorizing Kobe as well as the current ship that they were on. As after one quick back and forth between Alvida and Luffy eventually ends up knocking Alvida off the ship and sending her out to seas, defeating her in one blow, surprising everyone there, and using the stunned faces of everyone, Luffy and Kobe end up leaving, hopping on a boat that was nearby, and soon end up heading off to Shelltown, as that's where Luffy is going to recruit his very first crewmate, this being Roronoa Zoro, Luffy's future right-hand man and also the one who's currently being held captive at the marine base by Axe-Handed Morgan. As we end up seeing both Luffy as well as Kobe end up heading towards Shellstown, as after a quick and brief journey they end up arriving there to see Zoro as he was currently being held captive by the Marines. Although soon after finding out about exactly why he was captured in the first place, and also exactly about all the corruption that was happening in the Marine base currently because of Captain Morgan, this would cause Luffy and also Kobe to act, as Kobe ends up freeing Zoro while Luffy ends up getting his swords, and with the combined efforts of all three of them, they're actually able to put an end to Captain Morgan's tyranny, as Luffy ends up defeating him himself. As with that, Luffy ends up getting Zoro as a crewmate after gaining Zoro's respect, and after a generous feast as well as a party for them, they ended up going their separate ways, with Luffy and Kobe having a little bit of a scuffle after, well, the Marines were actually thinking that Kobe may be a spy for Luffy, and Luffy, trying to help him out, decides to talk a bunch of trash for him, and this caused Kobe to fight against Luffy, with both of them just fighting off against each other, or more precisely Luffy just dogging Kobe and beating the crap out of him until they both go their separate ways, with Kobe thanking Luffy for everything he's done for him. As this will kick off the beginning of the Straw Hats being formed, as we see Luffy throughout the rest of the saga slowly but surely recruit different members for the Straw Hats, as he ends up recruiting Nami, Usopp, and Sanji. As every single time he did this, he also had to fight his own fair share of enemies, but these enemies also allowed him to grow stronger with every passing one. As we see Luffy faced off against Alvida, we see Luffy face off against Buggy, we see him face off against Captain Kudo, we see him face off against Don Krieg and Arlong. Luffy faced off against countless different enemies, but every single time he would come out on top and grow stronger because of it. And he was not the only one, as every single one of the Straw Hats had their own individual moments where they also faced off against their enemies. Some of them physical and some of them emotional. As Nami, Usopp, Sanji, and Zoro, each one of them were faced with a challenge that they had to overcome. And slowly but surely they ended up working their way to that. As Nami had to face off against the trauma and everything that happened at Arlong Park, as after seeing Luffy defeat Arlong and just going through the hassle of helping her out, she was finally able to grieve and actually able to put an end to all that properly. Usopp was there to protect Kaya from Captain Kudo, and also, even though he was being called a liar by everyone in his village, he still stood tall and proud, even though he was being faced off against multiple different pirates, and also because he was scared. Sanji had to deal with the fact that legit there was more to explore than the Baratie, and that it was not his time to be there right now, as he still had to explore the entire seas first. And Zoro saw that his journey to become the #1 swordsman was still a long way to go, as he had faced off against Dracula Mihawk and lost incredibly badly. As every last one of the Straw Hats had their own little struggles that they faced during the East Blue Saga, but they overcame it some way somehow, and also became back even stronger because of it. But unfortunately for the Straw Hats though, is the fact that there are going to be some challenges that is just simply going to take much longer to overcome. As during the time of Logtown, when Luffy was trying to escape from the Marines, after going over there to stock up on supplies before heading off to the Grand Line, he encountered Smoker. And during the fight against Smoker, Luffy would unfortunately lose, as although this Luffy is stronger than the one that was currently by this point in the main timeline, that only meant that Luffy was able to put up much more of a fight, before eventually being taken down. As Luffy would actually lose to Smoker, and this would end up surprising Luffy so much, considering the fact that he, up to this point, has not lost at all ever since he set sail to seas. And this just comes to so much of a surprise as Luffy, as we end up seeing the exact same scene play out, with Dragon arriving, preventing Smoker from going any further, and Luffy escaping. And although things go the exact same way as it does in the main timeline, with Luffy escaping and going along with the rest of his crew to the Grand Line and just enjoying the experience, this loss against Smoker would be kind of in the back of Luffy's head, as it would be constantly playing on loop as Luffy just simply continues remembering it, as this is where we then see a glimpse of Luffy's obsessive side, as this will be the side that was awakened after the whole events when it came to Shanks and him getting the Straw Hat, as Luffy was already making promises to never lose again and already thinking about different ways to beat Smoker, or trying to overcome that weird devil fruit of his. As we see Luffy continue thinking about this in the back of his head, as him and his crew end up going to the entrance of the Grand Line. As we now continue on with the story, we see the Straw Hats eventually end up arriving to Reverse Mountain, as during that time they end up encountering Laboon, a generous whale, and when they do, after getting their ship swallowed up by Laboon, they end up encountering Crocus, who informs them about the log post and also about Laboon's history. Now this will cause the Straw Hats to feel sympathy for the whale, and after a brief battle against the Brookworks employees that were currently there, one of them being Vivi, who was currently, pretending to work for Crocodile. The Straw Hats would eventually end up escaping from Laboon, and soon after that, Luffy would end up making a promise to return, filling Laboon with hope and causing it to no longer damage itself, as the two Brookworks employees, including Vivi, would end up escaping from the Straw Hats to warn the others. As we now move on with the story, we now turn to when the Straw Hats actually end up arriving at Whiskey Peak. As just like in the main timeline, they're at first welcomed with a generous amount of hospitality and a bunch of other stuff, but soon after late at night, they end up finding out that it's a trap, which Zoro ends up facing off against a ginormous amount of bounty hunters, a total being 100 of them, before fighting off against Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine. I'll say the only real difference that went down here being the fact that Luffy actually thinks a little more, so that means that he doesn't actually think that Zoro is, mistakenly just terrorizing the people that were at Whiskey Peak, because, Luffy thought that in the original timeline. But in this timeline, Luffy actually ends up helping Zoro when it comes to fighting Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine. As we also find out that Vivi is a princess of Alabasta, as well as the whole civil war that was about to go on, and how Crocodile was behind it. So the Straw Hats of course decide to help Vivi, with Nami of course demanding a large price in exchange for the help, as they all decide to officially end up helping out Vivi when it comes to saving Alabasta. As we now finish off the rest of Whiskey Peak, with Luffy, Nami, Zoro, and Vivi pretty much all getting targeted by Brookworks employees, as Crocodile now finds out who they are, how they look like, and most of all is now sending all his workers there to prevent them from intervening with his plans. As this was only the beginning of the Alabasta saga, as we see the rest of it play out. As moving on from Whiskey Peak, we now see the Straw Hats going to Little Garden, as they go there in order to stock up on supplies, and also to collect more information about Crocodile as well as Brookworks. When they're over there, they face off against their challenges, this being Mr. 3 and Miss Golden Week, to which the Straw Hats are able to take them down with relative ease. And not only that, but they also find out more information about Crocodile, as after that brief little adventure, as well as stocking up supplies, and also saying goodbye to the Giants, to which yes, those interactions between the Giants still end up happening, with Usopp being heavily inspired, and not only that, but he also wants to visit the Giants' homeland. As just interacting with the two Giants, he truly believed that he has a chance of becoming a brave warrior of the seas. As continuing on with the story, we now turn to when the Straw Hats actually end up going to Drum Island, as after their short visit to Little Garden, Nami had accidentally been bitten by one of the insects there, causing her to get sick, to the point where the Straw Hats are desperately in the need for a doctor. Now on their way to Drum Island, they still end up having that miniature encounter with Wapol, as he was looking for an internal post. But you see, just like in the main timeline, the Straw Hats would not give it to him, but this is where a small difference would actually end up occurring. A small difference with a large impact. This being the fact that Wapol does not actually go back to Drum Island. And the main reason for this one is because of the fact that Luffy, thanks to the stress of actually seeing that Nami was also sick, and not only that, but thanks to a small bit of influence from Ultra Ego, as Luffy slowly was losing control, mostly because he was worried for Nami, this would cause Luffy to actually scare Wapol enough to the point where Wapol does not want to go back to Drum Island, allowing for the island to be free much sooner. As this will actually allow the rest of the arc to play out much quicker than it did in the main timeline. As the Straw Hats still end up arriving at Drum Island, there's soon allowed entry after Luffy shows how far he's willing to sacrifice just for Nami and of course for the rest of the crew, and soon after finding out exactly where Kureha was, Luffy climbed up the ginormous mountain full of snow just to find them. As after that, Nami got the right amount of healing, and not only that, but Luffy as well as the rest of the Straw Hats got to know Chopper a little bit better, as they soon find out that they actually want Chopper to join the crew. And after many days of staying over there, Chopper finally decides that he actually wants to join Luffy's crew, with the events between him and Kureha playing out the exact same way, with Chopper having a tearful goodbye and soon end up leaving with the rest of the crew, finishing off Drum Island. Not only that, but later on they will soon find out that Wapol was never returning back, as after all, Luffy scared him so much to the point where he's not going to go back to Drum Island, allowing for the villagers to realize that they should have really thanked the Straw Hats for that. As now finally, after moving past all of this, we can now turn to the Alabasta arc. Now this is where some pretty huge changes are going to be happening. As during the beginning of this arc, we see the Straw Hats soon end up arriving, and just like in the main timeline, Luffy would go off to get himself a meal. And while he's actually enjoying his meal, this is when he then encounters Ace, and then soon later on Smoker. Now while Luffy and Ace end up having a short reunion, they had to go their separate ways for a little while, as they were currently being chased by the Marines. As Luffy tells Ace that he's going to beat him up later, this is when they actually go their separate ways, with both of them having the Marines on their tails. But the thing is, the ones that were chasing after Luffy also include Smoker, which is exactly what Luffy wanted, because you see Luffy was actually leading Smoker into a trap. As you see, during the time of running away, Luffy will be taking very unorthodox routes, shrugging off the rest of the Marines except for Smoker, who's determined to capture Luffy here and now, until eventually Luffy and Smoker get into a secure place. Now while they're there, Smoker begins to go on a rant stating that he's about to capture Luffy here and now, but Luffy just simply shrugs off his speech and gets into a very familiar stance. The stance of Gear Second. As this is where we then hear an explanation from Luffy saying that after that one fight in Logtown, Luffy had already been thinking of different strategies or different methods to gain a boost of speed or strength or just something to overcome Smoker's abilities. As Luffy begins pretty much explaining everything that he learned from it, everything that he analyzed from the fight, and it was only a brief fight. I mean, don't get me wrong, Luffy put up much more of a fight than he did in the main timeline against Smoker early on, but still nonetheless, that fight was still pretty brief. So that actually caused Smoker to be caught off guard by it, as this is when Luffy, after entering the Gear Second transformation, he looks at Smoker with such intensity that causes him to step back, as he literally feels every single one of his instincts telling him to run. But before Smoker can even question about what his next move is going to be, this is when suddenly Luffy would then disappear in a blink of an eye and appear right in front of Smoker with his fist rolled back, as he tries to hit Smoker, but unfortunately he faces right through him. Now this annoys Luffy, but still regardless he goes back to fighting, with Smoker having to respond. As the fight between Luffy and Smoker will get underway, this is when we will then see a difficult issue happening for the two of them. The main reason why is because, number one, for Luffy, well, Luffy can't hit Smoker, because Smoker is a Logia user. Although Smoker can no longer hit Luffy, mostly because of the fact that Luffy is moving way too fast for him at this point. So that means Smoker is just not able to hit Luffy or land any blows on him. So pretty much this fight was turning out to be a standstill. Until eventually Luffy catches notice of Smoker's weapon, as he would then come up with a new idea. As halfway throughout this fight, Luffy will leave himself wide open for a blow, which Smoker will use the opportunity to, as Smoker will land a hit on Luffy's head, causing Luffy's body to just rattle from the impact. As Smoker gets some distance away from Luffy, thinking that now Luffy was out of commission since the weapon was infused with Sea Prism Stone, this is when suddenly he ends up looking at said weapon that was supposed to be in his arms, only to see that it wasn't there. As when he looks at Luffy, he sees that Luffy has stolen it away from him, as Luffy was now holding the very weapon that he needed in order to deal damage to Smoker. And all in exchange, he just took some damage. Some very large damage, as Luffy was actually bleeding from the forehead since, this weapon cancels out his Delph abilities, but still nonetheless, now Luffy was able to deal damage back to Smoker. And this really showed Smoker just how far Luffy was willing to go just to win. As he looks at Luffy in pure shock, this is when Luffy would then look at Smoker, and only for a brief moment his eyes would change color from the normal black to purple, surprising Smoker, as Luffy had only tapped into a little bit of Ultra Ego and was actually about to use it until he stopped himself. As this is when Luffy, now holding the weapon that Smoker was using, then decides to use it against him, as Smoker unfortunately ends up losing this fight against Luffy, as Luffy was just simply way too fast thanks to him having the Gear Second transformation, and was actually able to beat Smoker at this point of Alabasta. As Smoker will now be on the ground defeated by Luffy will end up tossing back Smoker's weapon before heading off, as Smoker would just be there wondering, if Luffy's willing to go this far just to win a fight, then how far is he willing to go for his dream? As that very thought made Smoker really question if he should continue hunting him down. As we move forward from this point, we see Luffy and Ace soon meet up after escaping on the Marines, with Ace questioning as to why Luffy got injured, with Luffy giving him a vague explanation. And soon after, the two brothers end up catching up with each other. Eventually they decide to reunite with Luffy's crew, with Luffy, introducing Ace and everything and all of them getting along, before Ace decides to tag along with them temporarily, with Ace also explaining that he's actually here to hunt down someone and to get information about him, this being Blackbeard that we find out later on. As now that this was explained, we can now continue on with the story, as most of the events after Ace joined them for a temporary amount of time remains mostly the same, until eventually Ace ends up going their separate ways, with Ace actually giving Luffy his Vivid card, which we're going to find out is really important later on. As moving on from that, soon the Straw Hats, after a small and little brief journey, they would eventually end up arriving to the Rain Base, where Crocodile was currently waiting for them. Now the events at the Rain Base would remain the same, always up to the point where the Straw Hats are able to get away from Crocodile and cause quite a ruckus, as we would see them try to escape Crocodile as they were making their getaway, only for Vivi to then be grabbed by Crocodile as he tries to bring her back in order to finish the job. But Luffy would of course intercept it as he tosses Vivi back to them and tells them to save the land of Alabasta, while he decides to take care of Crocodile. The Straws would do just that, getting away safely, leaving Luffy there to face off against Crocodile, as this is when a big change would then happen. As Luffy would end up seeing his crew leave, this is when he then turns to Crocodile and they begin to go a little bit of a back and forth, as both of them are just, taunting and pretty much explaining how they're going to win against each other, with Crocodile mostly pointing out about the fact that Luffy had so much potential if he just simply did not try to challenge him, with Luffy just stating that he's going to win against Crocodile and it's going to be over with immediately. As after that quick banter between the two of them, this is when the fight between the two would then begin. As Luffy would then be the first one to try landing a blow as he throws a fist directly at Crocodile, only for that fist to go right through him since Crocodile was a Logia user, which causes Luffy to be very annoyed since this is the second Logia user he has to face off against, and to make it even worse is the fact that this Logia user precisely, he doesn't have a Sea Prison's Throne weapon, as unfortunately Luffy does not have the same thing that he was able to use against Smoker here, which means this is going to be even more difficult. But it didn't matter to Luffy as at the end of the day, he was going to win. That was not a statement, it was a fact. As with that thought, we would then see Luffy continue on with his barrages of attack, as he would just continue attacking Crocodile over and over again, where Crocodile just simply able to phase through all of Luffy's attack thanks to him being a Logia user. As we see the fight between Luffy and Crocodile then continue on, with Luffy even tapping into Gear 2nd against him, but unfortunately, thanks to him not finding out about Crocodile's weaknesses just yet, unfortunately the outcome of this fight is going to remain the same, with Luffy getting stabbed and being seen as presumably dead. As Crocodile begins to monologue saying that the Grand Line isn't for everyone and pretty much saying that Luffy was just not meant to go far in this journey, as this is when he then summons out Quicksand in order to actually absorb Luffy in there and finish him off. But you see, this is when the big change will then happen, as this will be after Luffy gets absorbed into the Quicksand and after Crocodile tries to walk off. As just as it seemed as if Crocodile had won against the battle between him and Luffy and that Luffy had truly died, this is when suddenly Crocodile would then feel a pressure. And this pressure was so powerful that it caused him to freeze mid-step. And he was not the only one, as Robin, who was watching the entire fight, would also freeze up as well, as the pressure was so powerful that it even went all the way down to the Rainbow Base as well, as many of the people and tourists that were there also felt like freeze up at the pressure. As Crocodile then slowly turns to what he was looking at, as this when suddenly a purplish energy begins to emerge from the quicksand. Not that Crocodile could see it, but he could sense the pressure. As we the viewer would then see, as inside the quicksand, we will see Luffy with his eyes closed, as he was still heavily damaged, but as he was, this is when we would then see a very animalistic smirk appear on Luffy's face, as his eyes then shift from the normal black color to purple, and his hair does the same thing as well. As this is when suddenly bursting out of the quicksand, we will then see Luffy as he entered the transformation of Ultra Ego. Now Luffy would be in this state as now he was no longer holding back. There was no longer control, he was no longer going to restrict his movements, and to make it even better is the fact that now at this very moment, he already found out about Crocodile's weakness, his weakness to liquid. As Luffy would be there standing smirking, as the blood that was coming from the wound that Crocodile had gave him, he was literally making sure to have all the blood on his hands as he smirks. As when Crocodile sees this, he's just so caught off guard by the fact of Luffy's transformation and his drastic appearance. But before he can even comment on it, this is when Luffy would then disappear, as he would then barrage Crocodile with blows, as literally Luffy will be flying up in the air along with Crocodile and just beating him up around. If you guys want a reference, it was like when Rock Lee faced off against Gaara, which is ironic because both of them are sand users. As Luffy would quickly overwhelm Crocodile with his newfound strength, all while Crocodile was way too much in shock to even counter against Luffy or use any of his other techniques. As by the end of the fight, we will see Crocodile actually lose to Luffy, after Luffy ends up landing one last devastating blow on Crocodile's forehead, knocking him out completely and winning Luffy the fight. As Luffy would stand there still bloody in his transformation, this is when suddenly the transformation would then wear off, as Luffy, even though he was suffering from a large amount of loss of stamina, and not only that but straining his muscles, Luffy was still standing even after all of that, as he was standing over Crocodile before declaring that he was more than ready for the Grand Line and any challenges that come his way. As after saying those final words to Crocodile, this is when we then see Luffy then try to walk away, only for Luffy to then fall unconscious mid-step, as he used up all his stamina and energy during the fight. For now. As now that he's unconscious, this is when Luffy would then be approached by Robin, as she then decides to take Luffy and actually try to heal him up, all while Smoker would then arrive, only to see Crocodile now being down and defeated, as now that after finding out about everything that Crocodile was going to do, he decides to capture him, allowing for Crocodile to be captured much earlier, and not only that, but also allowing the Straw Hats to save the rest of Alabasta much quicker, putting an end to the arc. With the final changes being the fact that thanks to Robin actually healing up Luffy, this allowed the two of them to actually get to know each other much quicker, and actually caused Luffy to actually invite Robin to his crew, instead of Robin inviting herself. So that meant when the Straw Hats actually finally reunited and got back onto their ship, they weren't all surprised when they saw Robin after Luffy began explaining everything. So that means Robin actually joined the crew much earlier than she did in the main timeline. As with those final bits of information, we're finally able to see the Straw Hats leave Alabasta after saying a tearful goodbye with Vivi, and just like that we also see Luffy's bounty then skyrocket, But this time, instead of going for the same 100,000 as it did in the main timeline, in this timeline, Luffy's gonna get a bounty of 150,000, as his bounty had skyrocketed after he defeated not only Smoker but also Crocodile, as Smoker actually revealed that he lost to Rocket D. Luffy, and this caused Luffy's bounty to be taken up much higher, as the world government now see him as much more of a threat, especially since now he's taking care of Logia users while he's literally still in the Grand Line, and not even like in the late Grand Line, early Grand Line. So immediately they're beginning to feel cautious of Luffy. Oh, and another thing before I actually close off this segment, just to let you know, Zoro does actually end up getting a bounty, as finally he actually ends up getting a bounty by the end of Alabasta, just like he does in the main timeline. Just wanted to let you guys know before I continue on. As now from this, we can now move forward to the Skypiea Saga. As during the time of the Skypiea Saga, I'm not gonna lie to you, not much is really gonna be changing here, as the only few changes being the fact that number one, when the Straw Hat crew end up arriving there and they're looking for information for Sky Island, Luffy and the rest of the Straw Hats, they're not mocked at or anything like that. And the main reason for this was because of the fact that they actually fear Luffy, because Luffy's bounty got posted much sooner along with Zoro's, causing them to actually realize that Luffy is the real deal and they don't want to smoke with them, since Luffy has the highest bounty out of everyone in Jaya currently right now. Well, everyone besides Blackbeard, as that interaction between Luffy and Blackbeard plays out the exact same way, as both of them end up going their separate ways as Luffy continues on with his adventure to Sky Island. Now that entire sequence of trying to find where Sky Island is plays out the exact same way. Bellamy and his crew do not actually go after Cricket and the rest of his like treasures and everything like that, so that means that Luffy does not have to face off against Bellamy and the rest of his crew. And after that, Luffy and his crew actually end up heading off to Sky Island, where the events of Sky Island play out the exact same way, with the only difference being the Enel fight, as the fight actually ends much quicker than it did in the main timeline, as this will be due to the fact that Luffy's crew actually counters Enel's, and not only that, but Luffy actually has Gear 2nd much earlier on, allowing for Luffy to beat Enel much quicker and freeing Skypiea along with the rest of the Straw Hats, as after getting heavily rewarded for all their efforts, the Straw Hats will then continue on with their adventures, as we now turn to the next saga, this being the Water 7 Saga. As immediately off the bat, we will then see a big change happen as we enter the Water 7 Saga. As you see, during the time when the Straw Hats were actually going their way to Water 7 in order to get Mary fixed up, as she had taken up a large amount of damage, they stopped by at a nearby village in order to stock up on some supplies. But during the time there though, a ginormous beast ends up attacking the entire village, which causes the Straw Hats to then step up as they're about to face it off. But just as they were about to do so, this is when they then see a man, this being Admiral Aokiji, actually step up as he ends up freezing the ginormous beast in a large part of the water, surprising all the Straw Hats and also earning cheers from everyone that was currently at the village. As the village was celebrating for the fact that they survived and everything, we also have that same moment where Aokiji would talk to Robin, making sure to let her know about the impending danger that's actually going her way, which caused Robin to shudder. As after hearing these parting words from Aokiji, this is when we would then turn to the next day. As during the next day, this is when the change would then happen. One of the big changes at least. As during the time when Luffy ends up waking up and enjoying his time early in the morning, as he begins looking for the rest of his crew, as for some reason it was oddly quiet right now. As we see Luffy look around for a few moments before deciding to then walk off in order to find where his crew was, this is when suddenly as he was walking, he would then walk past Aokiji as he was heading off, before Aokiji then stops before letting Luffy know that if he were to continue with the way that he's doing things, then his crew is not going to survive at all. They won't make it past the Grand Line, and God forbid they won't even think about reaching the New World. And this made Luffy stop mid-step, as he would then gain a serious look before asking Aokiji what he meant. As this is when Aokiji begins to actually talk about Luffy's flaws, but the way that Luffy is not showing any sign of leadership at all, and although Luffy does have the power to actually go through and take down certain challenges, his crew just simply doesn't. As Aokiji begins to actually ask Luffy the question, what's gonna happen when Luffy is not around and they encounter a threat that they just simply cannot overcome. And this caused Luffy to stop for a moment before asking Aokiji if he wants to fight, with Aokiji not saying anything at all, with Luffy taking it as a sign of Aokiji not wanting to smoke. As he would then decide to continue walking towards his crew, now being upset and annoyed, this is when Luffy would then look upon a very horrifying sight. As all around in the ginormous area of field that was there, he will see every last member of his crew frozen solid into a frozen statue. As Luffy will be there looking, as every single one of them had different reactions. Zoro and Sanji would be there as they seemed to be trying to fight off against someone, but unfortunately they were frozen stiff, not able to do anything. Robin was of course like caught off guard by it, as you see that she had a shocked expression, and Nami, Chopper, and Usopp, each one of them had a horrified expression along with tears dripping from their faces. It was a very heartbreaking sight for Luffy as he just looks at the sight in complete horror, as Luffy just simply cannot make any sense as to how the scene in front of him could even happen, before finally he was able to connect the details and find out that it was Aokiji. As infused with rage, Luffy then turns around in order to actually fight against Aokiji, only to then suddenly be stabbed right in the stomach. As Luffy ends up looking down at the blade in horror, this is when Aokiji would then say his final words to Luffy just as Luffy was about to be turned into a frozen statue, warning Luffy that this will be a fate that will await all of them if Luffy doesn't start making these changes now. As just like that, Luffy would then be turned into a frozen statue, as Aokiji would then head off on his own, hoping that a lesson was learned here, but not only that, but also hoping that Garp realizes that this was literally Aokiji's way of just doing a favor for Garp. As really, he understood that Garp's grandson, although he has a large amount of potential, he knew that the way that Luffy was doing things, he was not going to make it far in the Grand Line. As Luffy would just be there frozen as well as the rest of the Straw Hats, this is where we then do a time skip. As we now time skip to a total of 2 weeks. Now that was during the time that the Straw Hats had remained frozen until the first week had passed as Luffy was able to break out of it. Now during that time, Luffy had made sure to take extra care of his crewmates, making sure to defrost them and make sure that they get the proper amount of heat in order to make sure that they were fine. But during that time, Luffy was not acting like himself. He wasn't boasting and laughing all joyously. No, Luffy was just there in pure concentration, being serious all the time. Something that you expect of someone who was a leader, but something that just simply didn't seem right for Luffy. Cause you see, the thing is, that loss to Aokiji, as well as the words that Aokiji told to Luffy, really had affected him deeply, as this causes Luffy to do something that he really does not like to do at all: thinking. As the only time Luffy really sees any use in this is really when he's actually fighting or when he's trying to gain control over Ultra Ego, but now he has to use it for something that's way more important, that being the safety of his crew and what his next actions are moving forward. As Luffy ends up taking a look at the Going Merry to see how damaged it is, he takes a look at his crew, which are all sleeping by now, and he takes a good look at himself as Luffy had recovered from the injury that he'd taken from Aokiji, but still nonetheless it was a reminder of his loss to Aokiji, which causes Luffy to be pissed off. As this will go on for a solid minute until eventually, after another time skip, the Straw Hats will soon all awaken, as Luffy then decides to have a serious conversation with them. As Luffy announces that changes are going to be made before they even leave this island, or before they even think about leaving this island, as unfortunately Aokiji's words strung some truth in them. That being the fact that the way things are currently right now, the rest of Luffy's crew are just simply not going to be able to keep up very soon. Now Luffy, he was confident in his strength, but the rest of his crew, he has to admit, especially when it comes to the weaker side of it, they're very much lacking. As during the time when Luffy was actually trying to treat the rest of his crew by himself, Luffy actually had a large amount of time to reflect on everything, as he realized one important thing. In the event that Luffy ever gets taken down by an opponent, and that opponent is still good enough to continue fighting the rest of the crew, is there even a chance that they're going to be able to get away from that guy? I mean, there's way less of a chance for them to even survive it. So that means that basically what Luffy's pretty much seeing by this point is the fact that if Luffy were to ever be taken out of the fight, the rest of the crew will become sitting ducks. As even though Zoro and Sanji can definitely pull their way around here, the rest of them need to do so as well. Cause if Luffy falls, then Zoro falls, then Sanji falls, what about the rest of them? Oh yeah, they're all gonna fall. As that could literally end up leading to every last one of them being killed, exactly how Aokiji instated it. So with those thoughts in mind, Luffy is gonna try his best to actually train his crew in these very moments. As even though he doesn't know how to really become a mentor and everything like that, he's still gonna try regardless. As after all, he needs to do it in order to make sure that not only is the rest of the crew safe, but he also needs to make sure that they're also prepared for the future. As with those final thoughts in mind, this is where we then do a time skip, as we now turn to a total of 1 month. Now yes, I'm gonna do a 1 month time skip before we go into the events that are fully gonna happen at Water 7. Now before you start questioning, wouldn't the events actually pass? Just to let you know, like I said, the Straw Hats actually end up defeating Crocodile much sooner and also Enel much sooner. So that means they had a lot more time to prepare for the events before going into Water 7. Which means the whole thing with CP9 and everything do not happen just yet, as now is actually about to kick off now that the Straw Hats are finally done with their training. As during that time of training, the Straw Hats truly had bonded and had grown closer. And not only that, but every single one of them had gotten stronger. And the main reason for this one is because of the fact that Luffy really was putting in an effort here to become a leader. Now while he doesn't like the role at all, like he doesn't like bossing people around and everything like that, Luffy does enjoy the idea of actually helping out his crew and helping every last one of them grow. And that was not the only thing. As every single one of the crewmates had made their own improvements, Luffy also made his own improvements as well. This being the fact that Luffy was learning how to master Ultra Ego. As throughout the time of that 1 month, Luffy was having many moments in order to practice for himself, and during that time he learned how to actually use Ultra Ego for much longer periods of time, which is something that Luffy needed in order to use this transformation. And that was not the only thing, as throughout the time of him actually spending time with the Straw Hats and getting to know each other better throughout the 1 month, they also found out about Robin's entire situation, especially when it came to the world government and also CP9. Now when they heard this, immediately all the Straw Hats felt some type of sympathy, but just like Luffy had done for Nami, Luffy did the same thing for Robin, as he places the Straw Hat on top of her before telling her that him as well as the rest of the crew are going to back her up no matter what, even if it meant going to war with the world government. As this would cause Robin to be very much happy and even shed some tears of joy, as she felt as if she finally found a home. As after that 1 month has now finally passed, we can now turn to when the Straw Hats are actually going to Water 7, where you see events play out similarly yet different, as by the end of it, regardless, the Going Merry is going to have to go. And this would very much upset Usopp to the point where he so desperately even wanted to fight Luffy. But after the rest of the crew all chip in to, give Usopp the just amount of therapy and everything that he needed, Usopp is able to calm down enough, and although he's very much sad and even sobbing by this point, he does eventually end up letting everyone know that he is alright with the Going Merry going away. It's just that the thing is, he wants at least one last week of memories with her. And the rest of the crew actually agree with that, as they all want to say their final farewells with the Going Merry and enjoy their last few moments, as the rest of the shipwrights were going to give them a new ship. As during this time of the week, we will then see the Straw Hats spend their very last few moments with the Going Merry, until eventually it was finally time for them to let her go. But you see, during that time though, this is when suddenly the entire event with CP9 would then kick off, as they actually attempted to convince Robin to go with them, but Robin, after being heavily inspired by her crew and knowing that they're always there for her, she then declines this, which caused CP9 to go on the attack. But before they do anything, Chopper, who was there with her, would actually end up defending her, and soon later on Sanji would then intervene as well, as he would make sure that they were not going to get away with it. And thanks to all that training that they got in, they're actually able to put up much more of a fight, before finally alerting the rest of the Straw Hats, as this time Robin does actually end up getting captured, as unfortunately only 1 month of training is not going to be enough to fill in the gap between Robin as well as the rest of CP9. As with those thoughts in mind, the Straw Hats would then reunite, and after the entire incident between what was happening with the shipwrights and everything, the Straw Hats would then begin to go on their journey to get Robin back, as we see the events leading up to Enies Lobby playing out the exact same way until the Straw Hats would finally arrive there, as it was finally time to get Robin back, and not only that, but to also make the world government know that this is war against them, as the Straw Hats were not going to let this go down lightly. As with those thoughts in mind, this is when we would then see the Straw Hats begin to unleash chaos in the rest of Enies Lobby, with Luffy leading the charge, as he'll be especially motivated, as we see him obliterate any soldier that came his way, until eventually he ends up finding the very first CP9 member, this being Bruno. As Bruno tries to pretty much state that Luffy stands no chance against him, unfortunately Luffy was not playing any games, as he actually ends up beating Bruno with one punch. Like literally only one punch, it was nothing at all. As Bruno tries to use the Rokushiki techniques to make it as if Luffy can't hit him or anything like that, unfortunately Luffy was just moving way too fast for Bruno to even react, causing him to lose immediately to Luffy. And soon later on, the rest of the Straw Hats would then join Luffy, as they all will stand 10 toes down against the world government. As just like that, this is when Luffy would then tell Usopp to then shoot the flag, to which he would do so, as this will be the declaration of war between the Straw Hats and the world government. As the rest of CP9 would just look on in complete shock, as this is when it was finally time for the battle between CP9 and the Straw Hats. Now the fight between them would just kick off, as every single one of them would go into their own separate battles, with each one being intense, but still regardless, each one of them having the same end goal, and that being to save Robin, which ironically enough, Robin does end up getting saved, but it's actually by Frankie, as he actually ends up taking down the guy who was actually holding Robin captive, and during the time they try to make their getaway, only to see that every last one of the Straw Hats were already finishing up their battles, with the last one to finish up being Luffy. Now Luffy's fight against Rob Lucci, that fight is going to be taking a completely different turn, as Rob Lucci tries to act as if he's more superior to Luffy, but unfortunately he gets dogged on, as he gets dragged throughout the rest of this fight by Luffy, who's not even taking him seriously, not even entering Ultra Ego, as Luffy pretty much explains that this is going to happen to anyone that tries to take any of his crewmates away from him. And this causes Rob Lucci to get even more pissed off, as he even enters into his zone transformation. But this only makes a slight difference, as Luffy is only taking small amounts of damage here and there, but not enough to put him out the fight. As eventually, after going back and forth for a while, Luffy would then end the fight by entering Gear 3rd, inflating his fist, and punching Rob Lucci directly out of the entire Marine base. As we would see Luffy standing there with very little injuries, as he would then look at the rest of the Marines that were currently there, this being the Marines that were called for a buster call. As they all look at Luffy in just complete surprise and everything, as they realize just how much of a threat he really is, this is when Luffy will then get into action as he then yells for the rest of his crew to then escape. And just as they were trying to escape, this is when the Going Merry makes one last appearance, as she rushes in there to save the rest of the Straw Hats and they make a very quick getaway. Now, the same results end up playing out, as unfortunately the Straw Hats have to say goodbye to the Going Merry. It's a very tearful and emotional goodbye, but regardless, all the Straw Hats are there and they're really glad that they made those final memories with the Merry before she left. As after saying their final goodbyes to their beloved ship, the Straw Hats would then return back to Water 7. As over there, after seeing how far the Straw Hats had went, and not only that, but also because of the fact that they saved Frankie's life, Frankie as well as the rest of the shipwrights will then begin to work on the Straw Hats' new ship, making sure to give them the best deal that they could ever get. Until eventually, finally, we will then get the Sunny, as this will cause all the Straw Hats to be very excited about the new ship. And eventually, after talking over things with Frankie and actually getting to know him, this is when Luffy will then invite Frankie onto the crew, to which at first he tries to decline it, but after some convincing from a very painful operation by Robin, eventually Frankie then decides to join the crew, saying goodbye to everyone, as the very last thing we end up finding out is the fact that the Straw Hats, every last one of them, actually has a poster, along with Frankie. Now the thing is, the Straw Hats posters are all like boosted up to how they were compared to the main timeline, as the main one that you should really focus on is the fact that Luffy's bounty by this point actually went up once again, as instead of being 175,000, Luffy is now moved up 325,000, making Luffy having the most highest bounty currently out of the worst generation, as we would find out later on. As this bounty increase will shock everyone in the crew, but also make them all happy, and some of them scared, this being Usopp and Nami and also Chopper, as yes, Chopper actually gets a legitimate bounty this time, not just a simple bounty of 10, since he actually put in the effort and work here. Plus also, I feel like the little guy deserves it. But still, regardless of that, the Straw Hats are now moving on with their adventures, their crews have increased a lot, and now we're moving on to the next arc, this being Thriller Bark. With the arc playing out pretty similar to the main timeline, but the differences are there, it's just that they're very minimal differences that I'm not going to focus on. As the main point of this arc being the fact that literally this arc is just adding Brook as a member of the Straw Hats, finding out about his backstory to Labu, and not only that, but also making the Straw Hats realize just how much of a threat they're becoming to the world government. As by the end of the arc, we still get the introduction of Kuma and everything. But as for how the arc actually plays out entirely, I have to admit, this entire arc is just basically speedrun by the Straw Hats, as thanks to Luffy actually taking up more of a role as a leader and actually having to think things way more often, this will cause the Straw Hats to actually move past this all much quicker. And during this time, when we actually get the chance to fight off against Kuma, Luffy would actually be awake during this time. As with the help and combined effort of all the Straw Hats, they're actually able to push Kuma away enough to the point where he has to make a retreat. As this will be another victory for the Straw Hats, although this will end up showing them once again that the training that they've been doing was something that they very much required. As if they didn't train at all by the time that Kuma had arrived, then they were 100% confident that not all of them will be walking out of here alive. So with those thoughts in mind, the Straw Hats will then continue on with their adventures, as this is where we then get to Sabaody. As we see the Straw Hats' adventures through Sabaody play out almost the exact same way as it does in the main timeline at the very beginning of it. But you see, during the time of the end, as this will be during the time when Kami was about to be auctioned off to the Celestial Dragon, and Luffy then decides to punch him away, causing, a bunch of chaos to just rake around everywhere, this is when things would then change. As the Straw Hats were making their getaway as they were planning to head off to Fishman Island, this is when suddenly they will then be stopped by a PX-7, one of the new machines that the world government had created. But once again, following the main timeline, the Straw Hats are able to destroy it thanks to their combined efforts. But that's when another one then appears, and not only that, but an entire Marine officer also appears as well. Now Luffy takes care of the Marine officer, as this time, even though the man has Haki, I do believe Luffy is still going to be able to hang with him, as Luffy throughout the time of fighting off against the man, he's actually able to beat him, surprising the Marine officer since he thought that with Haki, he'll be able to overwhelm Luffy without any difficulty at all, but apparently there were surprises there. But just as it seems as if the Straw Hats were about to win again, this is when Kizaru, the Light Admiral, would then appear, as he would then end up kicking Luffy away from the Marine, as Luffy will be sent flying, but soon is able to recover. But by this point, Luffy was kind of pissed off by that kick, as his eyes would then flash between the normal black color to actually purple, before he snaps back to the regular black color. As Kizaru tells the other admiral to stand down while he takes care of Luffy, this is when we then get to see a fight between Luffy and Kizaru. And unfortunately for Luffy, this is a fight that he is not going to be able to win. As Luffy continues facing off against Kizaru while the rest of the crew take care of the PX-7, this is when another one would then appear, surprising them since they couldn't believe that there was even more to come, as they realized that they were now running on borrowed time. As even though the Straws were very strong, unfortunately as strong as they were on a time limit here, as if more PX-7 eventually end up arriving, they could be quickly overwhelmed. So with that thought in mind, they continue fighting with the hardest that they can while also trying to find an escape route, until Luffy, after getting kicked by Kizaru once again, will then shout for all of them to separate, as unfortunately they cannot hang with these guys just yet. And this really hurt Luffy a lot, especially since he hated losing more than anything. But as Luffy was doing this though, this is when suddenly he would then be kicked once again by Kizaru until he eventually had enough as he taps into the power of Ultra Ego, telling everyone to run as he gives them the signal. As just as they begin to run away, Luffy then taps into the power. We see Luffy entering the Ultra Ego transformation as he would then stare down at Kizaru, although Kizaru will be taking in this new transformation in shock, as he literally feels the pressure setting upon him. As the Straws were making their getaway and everything, as Luffy then decides to fight Kizaru, this is when suddenly they will then hear a warping sound, as it will cause Luffy as well as the rest of them to stop for a moment. Luffy literally temporarily snapping out of his transformation as he then looks to the side as well as everyone else, only to see Usopp looking on in horror, as right there in front of him he literally saw Zoro be sent away by none other than Kuma, as he'll be standing there holding the same book as he usually does, while the rest of the Straw Hats end up screaming out in horror while Luffy only sees red. As we see Luffy once again re-enter the Ultra Ego transformation, as he completely ignores the kick that Kizaru threw at him, as he then disappears and flashes right in front of Kuma, as he then punches the man, sending him flying. Luffy was beyond pissed off as he tells Kuma to bring back Zoro or else, but before he can do anything else though, this is when Luffy will then be barraged by multiple light beams from all around him, as Kizaru tells Luffy to pay attention. Now Luffy shrugs off the blows and gets even angrier and stronger as he begins stomping on the ground like a maniac, causing it to shatter and causing miniature earthquakes to go around Sabaody, as it will cause the entire area where the Straw Hats were standing in to crack, as Luffy tells Kuma once again to bring back Zoro. But Kuma says nothing more as he then disappears and goes to every last one of the Straw Hats, as Luffy tries to stop him but Kizaru gets in his way. As Luffy continues watching this as one by one his crew gets separated just like they do in the main timeline, before finally he's alone. Luffy looks at the scene in complete horror as he couldn't believe that he lost his crew, as Luffy is still in the Ultra Ego transformation once again begins slamming on the ground over and over again, as this will cause literal ginormous earthquakes to happen in Sabaody, causing cracks to form on the ground in different areas as people are just wondering what's going on. And all the while Kizaru can't even get close to Luffy anymore since Luffy just seemed to be losing control, before finally Luffy then had enough of it. As he looks at Kuma in anger, as Kuma just stands there without saying anything before Luffy then rushes at him with as much force as he can. As during that moment Luffy even releases the Conqueror Spirit for a moment, catching Kizaru off guard before suddenly Luffy would then be transported away thanks to Kuma's ability, although Kuma had to admit that was very close since any moments later he could have sworn he would have been killed. As we see Luffy and all the Straw Hats end up going their separate ways now thanks to Kuma, eventually we see the same thing play out as they would arrive in separate different locations, with Luffy arriving at Amazon Lily. Now when he's there, we see the same events end up playing out, as Luffy still ends up getting introduced to all the Amazonians and everything. He ends up having to fight for the friends that he made there as he has to face off against Boa Hancock's sisters, to which he ends up winning, easily of course. And after finding out about, Boa's past and everything like that, and also Boa developing a crush on Luffy, this is when Luffy then finds out that Ace is going to be executed, as this will end up leading to him going to Impel Down, and soon later on to Marineford. As we end up going through these events, with most of these events playing out the exact same way, as we now turn to when it's finally time for Marineford, as that's what I really want to talk about. As we now turn to Marineford, as we see the fights that were going on as Ace was currently being chained up by the Marines and about to be executed. But just as it seemed as if things were about to go south, this is when Luffy as well as the rest of his gang would then end up arriving, as we see Luffy, Buggy, as well as Jinbei leading the charge. Crocodile would try to sneak, Whitebeard, but Luffy ends up intervening at the very last second, with Luffy declaring that he's going to become the king of the pirates and that Whitebeard and no other pirate is going to get in his way, surprising everyone since that was Luffy's way of declaring war on Whitebeard, which surprises everyone. As after that, Luffy then begins to go on a whole rampage trying to get to Ace, and that's where we begin to see things change. Now, thanks to this Luffy being way stronger than the one that was currently at this point of the timeline, Luffy's actually able to do way more damage, and also is able to take care of way more marines without costing himself too much energy, as Luffy was tearing through marines like they were paper, as they were unable to do anything against him. But sooner or later, this is when the vice captains begin to arrive, the ones that actually have haki, as Luffy is now forced to enter Gear 2nd as he maneuvers out of the way of every last one of them, and even has to tap into Gear's 3rd in order to make a difference as well, causing Luffy to cause even more of a ruckus throughout Marineford. And soon during the time after Luffy ends up taking care of a ginormous giant that the Marines were, or that was working for the Marines, this is when Luffy's family would then be announced, and more precisely his connections to Monkey D. Dragon, that being that Luffy is his son. And this causes many of the Marines, after hearing this, to immediately start going on a rant saying that Luffy can no longer be left alive, as they all rush at him, but Luffy, regardless of them, just simply plows right through them. But as Luffy was doing so though, he will end up taking some damage. He will be taking injuries, as no matter how strong Luffy is, unfortunately, there were always someone who was able to at least get like a small lick in, or even able to do some big damage. As Luffy continues going through this battlefield though, this is when suddenly he will then be intervened by none other than Smoker, as he will blindside Luffy, grabbing him by the neck and bringing him up to the air. Now Luffy, he's still in his Gear 2nd transformation, so he immediately begins to think of a strategy in order to beat Smoker, and when he sees the Sea Prism Stone weapon, he tries to reach for it, only for Smoker to then slam Luffy down to the ground. As Smoker then restrains Luffy the best way he could, and even applies the Sea Prism Stone weapon on Luffy's throat, as it looked as if Luffy was actually about to be captured. And just as it seems as if things were about to end this way, this is when suddenly we will then see a generous burst of energy then erupt from Luffy that ends up pushing Smoker back, and not only that, but also destroying his Sea Prism Stone weapon. As suddenly everywhere around the battlefield, a ginormous pressure begins to set in as Luffy lets out a ginormous roar. As we would then see Luffy rise up from the ground with purple hair and purple eyes as he entered the Ultra Ego transformation. As many people all around the battlefield then freeze up as they feel the pressure, with many of them literally foaming at the mouth as they collapse. As Luffy will be there standing in the crater that he had formed, as he began looking around the entire battlefield with hunger, as he then smirks as he looks upon his first prey, this being none other than Smoker. Now he dashes in a purple blur, and Smoker at first thinks that he can survive this easily, and in fact he thinks that Luffy's just gonna go right past him. But to his absolute surprise, Luffy, he ends up hitting Smoker and he passes right through him at first, until suddenly he would then end up spinning around at very high speeds and doing a roundhouse kick. This kick actually slamming Smoker so far to the point where he ends up crashing to the other side of Marineford, this causing Smoker to be knocked out. As everyone ends up looking at the scene in surprise, Luffy just continues smirking, getting into a battle stance as he begins rampaging throughout Marineford, this time causing even more damage. But the one who was super worried about this right now was Garp, as he sees everyone looking around in just complete shock and in horror, with Ace even looking at Luffy with a worried expression even though he was the one who was about to be executed. Garp would be the one who was worried. Heck, he was not even worried, he was actually scared. As the real thing that made Garp really terrified right there was the fact that Luffy, in that very short moment, after literally fighting Smoker, only a brief interaction with him right then and there, Luffy's body was somehow, some way, was able to immediately adapt to it and actually generate haki. Something that it takes multiple years to learn, and even more years to even master, yet Luffy did it in only a brief interaction. This will cause Garp to just realize just how dangerous this transformation was, as this ends up causing Garp to wonder if maybe he should step in right here, right now, because if things end up going way too far, then all he knows is that a ginormous amount of bloodshed is about to occur in Marineford, and he might be one of the only few people here that can stop it. As for Luffy, he was just rampaging throughout Marineford, and any Marines that get into his way, he would just immediately just take them down. Any pain that he went ahead and got, he got stronger because of it. And literally one of the few Marines that are actually able to damage Luffy quite a bit, Luffy just simply smiles at the injury as he ends up hitting the Marine back full force. And this ends up causing Marines who at first were just like beaten up to unconsciousness to straight up just die from a blow from Luffy, as his punches were getting so dangerous enough to the point where literally every single punch would cause generous shockwaves and a generous amount of destruction wherever they were aimed at. As his power throughout the time of rampaging was slowly growing more and more, as he was actually reaching levels of Whitebeard, but yet he was still not there yet. As Luffy continues rampaging, this is when Aokiji would then step in, as he tells Luffy once again that he was not ready for this stage, but Luffy just simply smirks, as just as Aokiji was about to freeze him, Luffy would just suddenly disappear. As Aokiji wonders what happened, this is when suddenly Luffy then appears right above Aokiji before suddenly slamming his head down into the ground, as Aokiji will be so rattled by the blow that he actually falls unconscious for a temporary amount of time, being out of commission throughout the time of Marineford. This causes everyone to look on in surprise, as it would then be announced that Monkey D. Luffy had taken down an admiral, and caused many of the Marines there to realize that Luffy was much more of a threat now, to the point where he almost is on the level of Whitebeard. So due to that, they immediately shifted half their attention onto Luffy, while the other half tries their best to slow down Whitebeard, as both of these guys were just a ginormous hazard that was approaching the bases of Marineford and getting closer and closer to Ace, as this caused many of them to just simply wondered, if any one of them were to get close to Ace at this very moment, is there anyone in their forces right now that can stop them? But there was one person who was not going to sit out of this being Akainu. Now during this time, Akainu was just there watching everything, and during the time when Whitebeard was actually approaching, he also decided to intervene. But now that Luffy was going on a rampage, not only that, but also finding out that Luffy was, Dragon's son, he immediately shifted the attention to the Straw Hat Child. As Luffy continues rampaging about, destroying multiple Marines that came his way, this is when suddenly his senses begin to act up, as he then narrowly avoids a magma fist that was actually about to hit him directly on the head, as Luffy ends up flipping multiple times before landing a few distances away from Akainu, as Akainu begins to tell Luffy that scum like him should not exist in this world, with Luffy not saying anything, as he just tells Akainu to get out of his way or else he's gonna kill him. And Akainu says nothing more, as suddenly both of them would then charge at each other with a war cry, as both of them would then shoot their own punches at each other. Both of these punches will end up clashing, as this will cause a ginormous shockwave to blow back many of the Marines and other pirates that are currently fighting, as it will literally cause the entirety of Marineford to be shaken up from it. As Akainu ends up falling back a little bit, mostly because of the fact of how powerful Luffy is not done, as even though his arm literally got burned badly because of Akainu's magma hands, Luffy does not give a damn, as he gets right up close to Akainu and ends up headbutting him full force in the head, causing Akainu to be rattled up as he just begins to barrage him with blows. Now this will go on until Akainu is able to respond back, as both of them are just going blow for blow with each other, not caring about any of the casualties that were happening midway through their fights. As Akainu would tell Luffy throughout the fight that this battleground was actually going to be his grave, with Luffy not saying anything more as he continues fighting against Akainu regardless of how much damage his body was taking. As both of them will continue clashing with each other, just going all around in place, eventually Luffy ends up getting so much of a boost enough to the point where even Akainu, no matter how much haki he has at this point, was getting quickly overwhelmed, as he just wonders how is it even possible that Luffy, someone who's only been a pirate for not even a year yet, was actually able to overpower him, someone who's been an admiral and someone who has multiple training for multiple years. As we end up turning back to the fight, as we see Akainu get blown back from another punch from Luffy, as right now he was coughing up blood and he was taking some very heavy damage right now, but even regardless of that, he was still trying to fight. As he ends up looking at Luffy right now, who currently right now was actually looking quite terrifying at the moment, as Luffy's eyes were glowing in ominous purple, and not only that, but there was some darkness that was covering his face, as this is when Akainu would then say devil. As this is when he then screams at the top of his lung that Luffy is none other than a Straw Hat Devil, and that he's gonna die here on this battlefield. And Luffy, when he heard this, all he did was scoff. As this is when, in retaliation, Luffy would then suddenly blitz Akainu, causing him to look around in complete shock, not being able to believe that this was actually happening, before suddenly Akainu would be hit in the gut, as his consciousness would just immediately fade to black, as he's unable to no longer withstand the impact from Luffy's blows. As now that Akainu had been taken down, the last admiral that was there was currently Kizaru, but he was getting occupied by Marco, as after all, Marco was there to support Luffy as told by Whitebeard. As now that there was no more admirals getting in his way, Luffy would then suddenly end up disappearing just as the other Marines were approaching him. As in a blink of an eye, as of course Sengoku begins looking around wondering what happened, this is when he then stops as he looks to the side only to see Luffy right there, as Luffy was standing right next to Ace in a crouching position. Sengoku, when he sees this, he immediately turns to Luffy and tries to hit him, but Luffy, without even looking at him, ends up just literally backhanding him in the face, causing Sengoku to be sent flying. As now all that was left was just Luffy, Garp, and Ace. As we see Garp just simply sitting there quietly, as Luffy is just there looking at Ace, as Luffy would then suddenly plead, as he says it in a soft voice, as he tells Garp, no, not even tells him, just pleads to him to not intervene. As even while in this state, Luffy still has enough control to at least show that he cares for his uncle and he does not want to go to the next step of this. But unfortunately, Garp had a job to do, as he tells Luffy that this was a path that he had chosen and a path that he wanted so much for Luffy to avoid. And when Luffy heard this, for a brief moment, you can actually see him tear up from this, as Luffy sheds one small tear before suddenly turning to Garp, and in one quick instance both of them would then exchange fists as they end up clashing, causing once again another shockwave to ring around the entirety of Marineford. The fight between Luffy and Garp is one to be told, as instead of it being just simply one blow between the two, it was a rock'em sock'em. It was literally going blow for blow, as this was just a way of Garp literally seeing that Luffy was now ready to take care of himself, while Luffy, this was his way of just simply growing up and saying goodbye to Garp. As we now turn back to the fight, as we see Luffy and Garp now standing currently right now, as both of them were sweating a lot, both of them were panting, and pretty much both of them were heavily damaged. Luffy being way more damaged since he was fighting throughout the entire war while Garp was just sitting there. As both of them ended up exchanging a determining glance, this is when suddenly we will then see them launch their final attacks, both of them throwing a punch at each other, as in their mind they will both be saying goodbye at the same time. As this devastating clash would rock the entirety of Marineford, shaking it once again and literally causing the entire island to actually begin to sink, causing many of the Marines there to panic and also the pirates. But by the time the collision was finally over with, we end up seeing Garp be blown back and actually falling, as when you look at Garp's arm you can see that it actually mangled from the blow. As he sees this, he ends up smirking, happy to see that Luffy was now all grown up. Although Luffy ends up looking at his own arm and curses, as his own arm was extremely damaged from that blow as well. But regardless, he had no time to worry about it, as he ends up rushing over to Ace and soon freeing him. This is when we would then get the same escape sequence, as Ace ends up breaking out the cuffs and is able to cause a ginormous wall of fire to appear, allowing for them to escape. As we end up turning to see both Luffy and Ace end up escaping, with Luffy unfortunately now being out of the Ultra Ego transformation, as his body just simply cannot maintain that any longer. As we see Luffy trying his best to continue running, as right now he barely has any energy to keep moving, but he still does so anyway, and not only that, but he doesn't even have energy to throw a punch. But Ace ends up covering him as well as the rest of the Whitebeard pirates, as they were doing their best to help Luffy since he was the one who actually rescued Ace. But just as it seems as if things were about to go exactly as they planned, as it seems as if Ace was about to walk out of here alive, and not only that, but a majority of their forces were a-okay. And not only that, but thanks to Luffy getting half the attention of the Marines, Whitebeard was not as injured as he was in the main timeline. And not only that, but also because of Luffy shifting the attention of Akainu onto him. So better yet, Whitebeard is actually good enough to actually follow along with his kids, and not only that, but also prevent more Marines from going after them. But just as it seems as if things were about to go to plan though, this is when suddenly Luffy ends up falling into kind of a near unconscious state, as by now Luffy's body was just running on pure instinct but was not actually catching any speed, as more or less Luffy was running at the pace of a speed walk. As Luffy continues trying to make his move over there, while Ace ends up trying to wake Luffy up and even tries to reach him, only to suddenly stop as he, as well as everyone else, end up looking at the horrific sight, as Luffy, just as he was about to continue running, would then be punched down into the ground, with his back being hit by a fistful of magma, as we end up turning our attention to see none other than Akainu, who was barely conscious by this point, who was bleeding quite a lot, but even regardless of that, he was still standing. As he stands over Luffy, as you can see him trying his best to just kill him right here, right now, as Luffy ends up screaming and howling in pain as he ends up slipping from consciousness. But right before he gets another chance though, this is when suddenly Marco and Ace then intervene, as they end up hitting Akainu with everything they got, causing Akainu to be sent flying and be sent off of Luffy, as Jinbei would then intervene as well, blowing Akainu away as well and getting Luffy to safety. As every last one of them were escaping, just like in the main timeline, Trafalgar Law would then end up appearing as he ends up asking for Luffy, with of course them having no other choice but to give Luffy to him. As turning our attention to the Whitebeard pirates, we see Ace currently right now actually trying to return back to Akainu and actually kill him for what he did to Luffy, as right now in Ace's mind he actually thought that Luffy died. But unfortunately, thanks to all the Whitebeard pirates joining together and actually forcing Ace back, he was unable to do anything. But just as it seems as if Akainu was about to get away with this though, this is when Whitebeard, just as he was making his escape along with the rest of his kids, this is when he then ends up turning around before landing a very powerful blow directly on Akainu, as he actually ends up landing it directly on Akainu's arm, his left arm more precisely. And just like that, Akainu ends up screaming as his entire arm was completely warped and just completely obliterated off his body. As he ends up cursing out the pirates, he ends up cursing out Ace and Gold Roger, and more importantly, he ends up cursing out Luffy and Dragon, as he begins to promise and vow that he's gonna hunt down and kill every last one of them, right before falling into unconsciousness due to him already being overwhelmed by all the pain. As just like that, this will be the end of Marineford. As we see Luffy eventually getting the right treatment that he needed, as the main difference here being the fact that the scar that Luffy had, the one that was like across his chest, is instead now across his back, and it's a very nasty one. As we end up seeing Law, and not only that but also Marco actually trying to help out Luffy, as they were doing everything in their power in order to make sure that Luffy ends up coming out alive in this. As Marco wanted to actually help out Luffy, not only because he was Ace's little brother, but also because of everything he'd done during the time of Marineford, as he really helped out the Whitebeard pirates, and if Luffy wasn't there, then Whitebeard might not be standing to this very point. Although Law, he much more was focusing on a future investment. But regardless of that, both of them ended up doing their combined efforts to actually save Luffy, which he luckily was able to survive, although it was very close. As we end up doing a time skip for when Luffy eventually ends up waking up, we see many people really happy to see him and everything, especially Boa Hancock, who actually allowed the Whitebeard pirates, as well as, Law, to stay there for a little while, only because of the fact that they were there to heal up Luffy. As after making sure that Luffy was alright, with Ace telling Luffy that he was incredibly stupid for doing all of that, but regardless, he's very grateful to see that Luffy was still alive, and also he was grateful for Luffy's help. As after those two had a heartwarming brother moment, this is when Luffy then actually begins to be asked a question about what he's gonna do next, with Luffy suddenly gaining a very determined and yet serious look. As this is when suddenly a voice would then ring out telling them that Luffy already has an idea about what he's gonna do next, as this is when we would then see Rayleigh, who ends up making the same appearance just like he does in the main timeline. As Rayleigh ends up making his appearance known and everything, Whitebeard and Rayleigh will have a small little interaction, with Whitebeard being really happy to see Rayleigh again and also asking him if he wants to fight, with Rayleigh of course declining, saying that he's way too old for that. But moving on from the introductions though, this is when suddenly Rayleigh would then turn to Luffy before asking him if he's ready, with Luffy thinking long and hard about it one last time before nodding his head, as it was the right thing to do and it only made sense. After that war, Luffy saw more than he ever could. He had suffered injuries that no person, or no normal person at least, would be able to survive, and most of all, he understood one very important thing, that even though with the boost strength and speed that his crewmates had gotten after that 1 month training, they just simply were not ready for the Grand Line. So with those thoughts in mind, this is when we then see Luffy then pull the same thing he does in the main timeline. He does the exact same thing, ringing the bell and everything, initiating the beginning of a new pirate era, and also making sure to send flowers down as a way to pay respect for all those that had fallen. As after that, Luffy will end up returning back, and also the rest of his crew will understand the message as well, as they all begin to cry up a little bit about the fact they're not going to be able to see each other for a very long time, but regardless, they understand Luffy's wishes and will do just that. As just like that, we will then do a 3-year time skip. Now, the training for the 3-year time skip will play out almost the exact same way, with a few changes here and there. Now, for Luffy's training, his is going to be bumped up by a large amount, since thanks to the ginormous fight in Marineford, Luffy's experience when it came to hockey was boosted up exponentially. As literally thanks to him being an ultra ego and actually learning how to, fight using hockey, his body was able to kind of adapt to it or kind of click with it almost instantaneously. But the thing is, maintaining hockey was the real problem, as although he's able to actually use it sometimes, he's not able to use it like 100% of the times. So with that, Rayleigh decided to bump up Luffy's training and put him in much more harder and much more difficult situations. And the same thing can be said for the rest of the Straw Hats, mostly due to the fact that, just like Luffy, they were way stronger than their main time themselves. So that means they actually decided to put themselves through more difficult training in order to get themselves to be way more stronger. So with that, after going through all this training, they eventually end up reuniting after the 3 years, as every last one of the crew members ended up reuniting. But there are some changes, this being the fact of Luffy's bounty, as Luffy's bounty after the 3-year time skip had changed by a lot, as Luffy's bounty had changed from being at 325,000 to now being a whopping 700,000. And the main reason for this one is because of the fact that during the time of Marineford, Luffy did a lot more than he did in the main timeline. I mean, he literally took down 2 admirals, alright? He took down Aokiji and he took down Akainu. And not only that, but he also faced off against Garp when he was semi-serious, as this will end up causing Luffy to be seen as way more of a threat to the world government than he did in the main timeline, as this will end up causing many people to actually want to stop by and actually join Luffy's crew after being impressed by his strength. But unfortunately, just like in the main timeline, Luffy completely just ignores all of them, or better yet, he just simply does not know their existence, as all the Straw Hats will then eventually end up gathering and eventually continue on with their adventures. As we see many changes that actually end up happening, but most of these changes end up having the same outcome. As during the Fishman Island arc, we see the Straw Hats save the entirety of Fishman Island after we end up seeing a bootleg Howdy, trying to start a rebellion against all the fishermen and everything and trying to change their ways. but the Straw Hats end up preventing them, as well as showing everyone across the entire world just how strong they really have gotten, as literally Luffy was able to take care of majority of them just by simply using Conqueror's Haki, and Luffy didn't even have to enter Ultra Ego or Gear Second to do anything, as literally throughout the entire time he was literally in base form. And another thing that actually ends up happening during the time of Fishman Island is the fact that we end up finding out that number one, Whitebeard actually retired as an emperor, as he's no longer able to continue on being, one of the emperors of the seas. Instead, he's actually being replaced by none other than Ace, as throughout the time that Luffy had been training, Ace had still been out there in the New World, and he was causing quite a ruckus, especially since he was still going on the hunt for, Blackbeard. Which, speaking of Blackbeard, he isn't at the level that he was during this point, as thanks to him not getting, Whitebeard's fruit and everything, he definitely was not at the power level that he was supposed to be at. But regardless of that, Blackbeard is still a threat to be reckoned with. So the world government has him at actually a million bounty, just as the rest of the emperors. It's just that Blackbeard is not considered an emperor. And after finding out about this information, we can now move on to the next two arcs, this being Punk Hazard as well as Dressrosa. Now, Punk Hazard does not change way too much, as it still ends up ending the same way, with Luffy and Law end up having an alliance, as they actually are going to work together to take care of Kaido. And not only that, but also because of the fact that they end up saving all the children and getting them out of Punk Hazard. As now that we move past from that, we can now go to when it's finally time for Dressrosa. As during the time of Dressrosa, there was quite a few changes, but regardless, the outcome ends up playing out the same way, with Doflamingo getting defeated and the entirety of Dressrosa being saved. The few changes being the fact that thanks to Ace actually being alive and everything, that means that Sabo and Ace can actually have a reunion. While Luffy and Ace were actually really excited to have a reunion as well, but Luffy now finding out that Sabo is actually his brother and everything, and letting Sabo know that Ace should know about this, with Sabo already planning to make communication with Ace and really excited to go meet his brother once again. All while during the fight against Luffy and Doflamingo, as that was the other change that happened, Luffy actually prevented Doflamingo from actually injuring Law enough to the point where he actually separated his arm. So this caused Law to actually be in the fight for a lot longer, and also caused Law to, not suffer as much pain as he did. But besides that, the rest of the arc plays out the same way, with Luffy beating up Doflamingo by entering Gear 4th, as not yet Luffy hasn't even think about using Ultra Ego, since he knows that none of them stand a chance against that. As now that we're done with Dressrosa, we can now continue on with the next few arcs, this being Zou as well as Whole Cake Island. As throughout these two arcs, we see Luffy as well as the rest of the game facing off against their similar struggles, but the thing is, there are differences here and there, mostly because of the fact that the Straw Hats are actually stronger than they were at this point in the story. With Luffy especially being the one to make the most changes here, as thanks to Luffy being so strong up to this point, this actually caused him to be he actually ends up defeating his opponent much sooner than he actually did in the main timeline. And not only that, but although he does defeat the opponents much sooner, there are some things that play out pretty similar to the main timeline. For example, during the fight against Luffy and Katakuri, in this timeline we see Luffy actually facing off against him, and even though he was struggling against him, he didn't actually try running away from Katakuri in order to build up his transformation for Gear 4th. Instead, Luffy continued fighting him all the way up to the point where he decides to show off Snake Man. But even with Snake Man, Katakuri was putting up a good fight, being able to dodge some of Luffy's attack and actually being able to damage him even more, as this will cause Luffy to realize that Katakuri isn't like the others and realize that he actually needs to take him way more seriously. So with those thoughts in mind, this is when Luffy then decides to do something surprising, as we then see the transformation of Snake Man didn't be warped, as suddenly Luffy's entire body would be covered in a purplish aura as his haki was flaring about the entire battlefield. As this is where we then see Luffy then enter Ultra Ego, but combining it with Snake Man. As this transformation was something that he learned throughout the training of Rayleigh, as after learning all about Gear 4th and everything, Luffy decided to combine it with none other than his Ultra Ego, as this will end up causing Luffy's transformations to go through a ginormous boost of strength and speed, basically making Luffy invincible, although the thing is this does tax him way quicker, so that means Luffy is only on a limited time span when he's in this transformation. But it didn't really matter to Luffy since now his victory was guaranteed, as just like in the main timeline, Luffy and Katakuri go at it, but unfortunately Katakuri is not able to do anything, as Katakuri quickly gets overwhelmed by all of Luffy's attacks, as he tries his best to try to see what's Luffy's next move in order to dodge it, but to his surprise though, his observation haki can no longer keep up with Luffy, as this will cause Katakuri to do nothing more but resign the fight, as there was nothing else he can do, as he ends up accepting the fate as he gets bombarded by a bunch of blows from Luffy, as these blows will be so powerful and so quick enough to the point where it destroys the entirety of the area where they were fighting at. as by the time Luffy was done, he ends up exiting out the transformation, being exhausted of course, since he had to combine not only Snake Man but also Ultra Ego together. But regardless of that, he was still able to stand and continue moving, as we'll end up seeing that laying in the crater will be Katakuri, as unlike in the main timeline where Katakuri ends up giving the win to Luffy, in this timeline Luffy actually ends up winning against Katakuri fair and square. As just like that, Luffy ends up walking out of Whole Cake Island, as the rest of the events end up playing out. Although as much as I wanted Luffy to face off against Big Mom and everything like that, the one big problem is the fact that after the fight with Katakuri, he was way too exhausted to do so. So unfortunately Luffy did end up having to move. With the really good thing that actually came out of this arc being the fact that number 1, Luffy got Jinbei to join his crew. Not only that, but Luffy also was able to retrieve Sanji back from Big Mom, and not only that, but Luffy's bounty had once again increased. But this time, Luffy's bounty was actually way higher than it was in the main timeline, obviously, since once again, Luffy was proving more and more that he was becoming more and more of a threat. So due to that, his bounty had skyrocketed once again. This time, he's actually in the 2 millions. As in the main timeline, by this point, his bounty was only at the 1 millions. So due to that, this caused many people all around to begin claiming that Luffy is now the 5th Emperor of the Seas, which caused many people, especially Big Mom and Kaido, to feel disgust. And speaking of Kaido, this is where we now turn to the very next arc, this being Wano. As at first, we end up seeing the beginning of this arc play out pretty similarly. This being mostly due to the fact that we end up seeing that Luffy and as well as the rest of the Straw Hats had finally ended up regrouping, and even better, it seems as if things were finally going to go underway of taking down Kaido and of course saving the Wano country. But unfortunately, just like in the main timeline, Kaido in a very drunken state ends up obliterating the Straw Hats and supposedly ends up killing them. And this causes Luffy to go off the rails, as we end up seeing that very first fight between Luffy and Kaido, with things kicking off way better than it did in the main timeline, since Luffy was actually doing some pretty big damage on Kaido. But the thing is, Kaido was, well, Kaido for a reason, which means he's able to bounce back from all these blows and just simply shrug it off, until eventually Luffy ends up entering his Gear Force transformation and rushing at Kaido, only for Kaido to then one-shot him. But you see, just as Kaido ends up one-shotting Luffy, this is when, just as Kaido was about to throw Luffy away by telling his grumps to throw him in prison, this is when, inside of Luffy's psyche, we actually end up seeing something else entirely, as we see two conflicting energies just swirling around as they were fighting off against each other. As we see an energy being white, as it will be there just simply releasing a joyous energy, while the other one was a dark purple, as it was just swirling around releasing chaotic energy, as both of them were conflicting with each other at first until eventually they begin to spin all around Luffy's body before finally they merge into one. As on the outside, as we see the men approaching Luffy as Kaido was about to walk off, this is when suddenly we end up seeing Luffy end up releasing ginormous large amounts of the Conqueror's spirit, as this was enough to knock out the men, causing them to foam at the mouth, but also caused Kaido to stop in his tracks, as he himself also clambered up because of the impact of the Conqueror's haki, as he was not expecting that from Luffy. But before he was about to shrug it off and continue on though, this is when suddenly he would then hear chuckling, as Kaido ends up stopping in his tracks as he ends up turning to Luffy's body, as Luffy would then begin to actually roll around on the ground, as even though he was bloody and battered and bruised, he was still laughing, giggling, as this is when suddenly Luffy actually begins bouncing on the ground, bouncing his body on the ground as Kaido ends up looking at him, wondering if he was high, until suddenly Luffy begins full on belly laughing as he begins releasing another wave of Conqueror's haki, but this wave is different. As when Kaido gets hit by this wave, he ends up seeing that the entire area that they were at that was actually hit by the wave that, Luffy had released, they had been affected. As all around the affected areas, we would then see cracks beginning to form. As in those cracks, we would then see both purple and white energy just emerging from them. As this is when Luffy begins giggling and laughing once again, as we see him then take on a new transformation. As Luffy's clothes would then take on a white yet a light purple color, and not only that, but Luffy's hair changes from the normal black color to now a light purple color as well, with his eyes doing the same thing. As this is when Luffy ends up announcing that this is his peak, as we see Luffy enter the iconic Gear 5. But this time there was a change to it, as instead of Luffy being the laughing and joyous giant that would go around and just simply whop Kaido, he was now a laughing and grinning devil. As we end up seeing Luffy's very presence just warping the entire area that was around them and causing more cracks to seep all around Wano, as these cracks were actually being formed due to the fact that thanks to Ultra Ego merging with Gear 5, there has been a ginormous warp in Luffy's abilities right now. As instead of Luffy just turning the entire ground rubbery and everything, it has changed. As basically instead of that, Luffy is basically causing Ragnarok with his very presence, as he's destroying everything that is around him or is at any close range to him. As Kaido was being blown back by the energy waves that Luffy was just releasing, but when he sees this, he immediately snaps out of his drunk state and begins to laugh before stating that Luffy is just the person that he was looking for. As this when suddenly he then dashes at Luffy trying to engage in combat, but Luffy, after looking at the Genemus Club, does nothing more. As this when suddenly he then grins mischievously as he grabs the club, and immediately after Luffy came into contact with the club, it was obliterated to millions of pieces, almost as if it was erased from existence. As like I said, Luffy's very presence now, instead of just making it to where everything is rubbery, anything that was close to him or anything that was in the surrounding area of him will end up slowly but surely getting destroyed. And if you came into close contact with him, you will be just completely obliterated. As this was the power of Ultra Ego pushed to its absolute limit, as this was the power of destruction. As Luffy begins giggling, this is when he then rushes over at Kaido, with Kaido being caught off guard by the fact that his club was just completely obliterated, as he would then be punched by Luffy, with this punch actually destroying Kaido's skin, surprising Kaido as well as many others who were watching, since Kaido's skin was known to be impenetrable until now. As Kaido would be sent flying and actually reeling back from the pain of the injuries, he, instead of actually falling back in terror and everything, he just laughs it off, as he then says that this was exactly what he was looking for. As without any hesitation, he then enters the hybrid mode, as he then begins bouncing around all around the entire battlefield, which is now Wano, as him and Luffy then begin their battle. As we see both Kaido as well as Luffy then rush at each other, as both of them end up slamming their attacks, with Kaido's attack doing nothing more but giving Luffy strength, and not only that but causing him more damage, with Luffy's attack just, of course doing way more damage to Kaido. As both of them will be going at it with each other, with Kaido's body getting destroyed bit by bit as he comes closer and closer in contact with Luffy, with him not caring at all, as this was exactly how he wanted it to go. As Luffy continues just giggling, laughing, as he's enjoying the fight, holding it without holding anything back now because his crew was supposedly gone. This will go on for quite a while until eventually it was finally time for it all to end. As by the time the smoke would then clear, as we end up seeing Kaido and Luffy once again, we see Kaido now currently still in his transformation, except it looked worse for wear. As Kaido by this point was missing an entire arm, not only that but literally half of his body was literally destroyed practically, as he was bleeding by quite a lot, but even then he was still standing. As we end up looking at Kaido one last time, as he looks Luffy directly in the eyes before stating that Luffy was the one that he was waiting for, that Luffy was the one who was going to make this world change, and that he was very glad to be the first one here to see it. As with those thoughts in mind, Kaido ends up closing his eyes, as Luffy with a grin would then suddenly end up rushing at Kaido before reeling his fist back and slamming it into the previous strongest thing in the world. As just like that, with that one last blow, we will then see Kaido's entire body just completely be dissolved by the power of Luffy's new transformation. As now that Kaido had been defeated, all around many had lost hope to continue fighting, as after all Kaido was the strongest thing that they ever knew, yet Luffy here just simply broke the scale immediately. As Luffy ends up exiting out of this transformation, this is where we now change scenes as well as do a time skip. Soon later on, after Luffy ends up getting a well-rested nap, as many of the people who were there and actually willing to help out Luffy and everything soon end up going over there to help him recover and everything. And soon after doing this, we end up finding out later on that all the Straw Hats are actually still alive, as when they find out that Luffy was actually able to beat Kaido and actually kill him, they're surprised about how quickly he was able to do it, and not only that, but they were surprised by the transformation, as there was actually photo proof about what Luffy's transformation was, as this will cause them to just simply sigh at just how crazy Luffy is, but also at the same time they're very proud for the fact that they actually joined his crew. While at the same time Momonosuke and many others who had lived in Wano were very happy and very they were just having an entire party by this point, celebrating about the fact that Kaido as well as Orochi's reign was over, as finally they're able to restore this country back to how it was, as they had to give their thanks to Luffy and all the Straw Hats for that. As moving on with the story once again, after the Straw Hats were able to actually clear out Wano and everything, the Straw Hats once again continue on with their adventures, facing off against many different threats, and pretty much going on their very adventures that they always wanted to have. As by the time after moving multiple events into the future, we end up seeing Luffy, as by this point he had found the One Piece, he had become king of the pirates, and by now his journey has been finished. As Luffy ends up looking on at the sky with a smile on his face, this is when he begins laughing, as he can already tell that the next generation is going to be even crazier than the last, and he was all the more excited to see it. As with those final words from Luffy, we end up turning to the final scene of this what if, as we end up seeing a picture of the Straw Hats, as every last one of them had a smile on their faces, with every last one of them actually enjoying whatever they were doing at that time. But still, regardless, it was a very heartwarming picture nonetheless, as it showed a picture of the Straw Hats, the most powerful crew to have ever existed. As with those final thoughts in mind, this will be the end to What If Luffy Had Ultra Ego. Thank y'all so much for tuning to this what if, and thank God I was actually able to finish this what if. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry guys. Like, this what if was delayed for so long, and it was mostly because of the fact that I didn't know how to do it. Like, literally, I'm not gonna lie to you, that entire time I completely just forgot how to do a One Piece what if. Like, literally, it was insane. I just sat there, and when I found like a good way to do it, I found that was taking like way too long. Trust me guys, this what if was initially about to be 5 hours long, y'all. And I'm not joking at all, like, it was crazy. Like, I had to take a good look at this, and I realized I can't go ahead and edit all this. I can upload this. So I had to go ahead and scrap that one and start off from scratch. And I did this multiple times. But yeah, guys, but still, regardless, I'm really glad that I was able to finish this One Piece what if. And if you guys do want more One Piece content, or like more One Piece what if, then I will go about with making them and everything, as I do have to get better at it though. Definitely, I'm still learning how to make these what ifs, and more or less how to make these what if for like different stories and everything, since I've been watching like a lot of anime, and I've been watching like, you know, a lot of what if requests and everything. So yeah, a lot of them are going to be coming up and everything, so I've got to get better at doing this. But still, regardless, it's fun making these what if and everything. It's very fun to, you know, make content regardless of that. And regardless of that, I'm really glad I was actually able to post this video. But still, nonetheless, y'all, I don't really got much else to really say now, as it's your host Sage Sim right here, and it's time for him to sign off. So with that being said, peace and have a lovely day.